Hey guys, so the first thing we're going to do today is we're going to talk about political parties. First off, what are they, right? That's a group of people, similar political views that work together to get candidates elected and push for their agenda in government, okay? Now, interestingly enough, not all of our founding fathers were on board with this. In his 1796 farewell address, George Washington actually warned about the dangers of political parties. He did not think they were a good idea. He thought that the polarization that would eventually come from them would start to kind of tear the country apart. If you've been paying attention for the last several years, we kind of see that, right? People that are on the right, people that are on the left, not only do they not get along, but they generally don't like each other, right? Their ideas have become pretty much polar opposite in a lot of aspects of the way that our government is run. By 1790, though, like shortly after the Constitution had been signed, the first political parties were actually formed. The first was the Federalist Party. That was formed by Alexander Hamilton. Shouldn't be a surprise there. He was one of the main authors of the Federalist Papers, pushing for a strong federal government. And the other one was the Democratic Republicans, that were led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Okay. Now, these two political parties were not as polarized as parties are today. Okay, with these two political parties, their main differences were this. The Federalists, they wanted a strong federal government. They wanted strong ties with England. The Democratic Republicans, they wanted more states' rights, less federal government, and strong ties with France. Okay, so those were their big differences. Now, it wouldn't take very long for these political parties to start branching off into other things. The Whig Party would be created. Their main thing was is they wanted to build more infrastructure, roads, bridges, things kind of that we take for granted now. Uh, they wanted to put more money into that, and they wanted to recharter the Second National Bank of the United States, which had been dismantled under Jackson. A few things like that. Now, something happened shortly after the Whig Party was created. Now, I'd say shortly, but it was quite a few years. It was in 1854. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was done away with. Now, the Kansas-Nebraska Act involved the 3230 line. Okay, so you couldn't have slaves above that line. Now, when they abolished that, that's when the states of Kansas and Nebraska were formed, and they decided whether or not they were going to have slavery in those states or not. And that is kind of one of the things that pushed us to forming the Republican Party. The Republican Party was formed from people from the Whig Party, from anti slavery Democrats, and from free soilers, people that would move out west in order to get free land, things like that. Now, the Republican Party ran their first presidential candidate in 1854. They didn't win. They ran again with Abraham Lincoln in 1860 and won the election. Shortly after, the Civil War would kick off, and the Republicans, would stay in power throughout the Civil War and into the 1870s. Now, the the Republican Party and the Democrat Party have a lot of pretty major differences nowadays. They had some huge ones back then. Okay, and one of the biggest things that caused Abraham Lincoln to win was actually that the Democrat Party had splintered from itself. So the Democrats in 1860 ran two candidates. They ran a Southern pro-slavery candidate and they ran a Northern anti-slavery candidate. So they split that vote. Interestingly enough, Abraham Lincoln was the last third-party candidate to win, and that was set us on this two-party system kind of thing that we have now. All right, obviously we're not a two-party system. We have other parties, but they generally don't tend to win any of the major seats, the presidency or anything like that. Okay. Now the Republicans nowadays are known for being very conservative. The Democrats are known for being liberal. It's not to say that you can't have a conservative Democrat or a liberal Republican. You just don't see it as often. And when you do, they tend to be looked down upon by their party, kind of for not towing that party line. And that comes down to polarization, right? Now, polarization is when political ideologies, or at least in this context, when political ideologies start to differ dramatically, right? So, right now, we're extremely polarized. The right is very right, the left is very left. They don't meet in the middle near as often as they used to in politics. And going outside of those lines, like I said, is looked down upon by other people in the party. Now, let's talk about third parties. We do have third parties in this country. Uh, of those, the Libertarians and the Green Party are probably the most prominent. The Libertarians formed in 1971 and didn't really gain that much traction, though, until more recently. In 2016, Gary Johnson ran on the Libertarian ticket. He took 4.5% of the popular vote in the election, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it is, at least for a third party. He was the former governor of New Mexico, and in that time, though, he was actually a Republican. He switched to the Libertarian Party before running for the election. The Green Party has been around since the 1980s. It's an international party. It started in Australia, New Zealand, Germany, made its way to the United States. And a woman by Jill Stein has been their candidate several times over the last 2 decades. Now, we have had third parties make significant progress in elections. In the election of 1968, a guy by the name of George Wallace, running on the American Independence Party, actually took 5 states. Of those, it was Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, Louisiana, and Mississippi. Now, luckily, he didn't win because he was actually running as the pro-segregation candidate. He wanted to do away with a lot of the civil rights laws and movement that had gone on previously before, and ended up winning 5 states. Now, one thing that did do with that kind of support, he ended up being in the debates. So, to be in the debates, you needed to have, at that time, 10% of the popular vote in polling. Now it's 15%. But he was in the debates. It's kind of hard to get in the debates, so you don't see it all that often for third parties, but it does happen. It happened in 1912 with Theodore Roosevelt. 1968, of course, we had George Wallace. 1980, it was John Anderson running as an independent. And then in 1992 and in 1996, we had Ross Perot in both of those. So one of the things about third parties is people kind of refer to them as spoilers. In other words, they can't win the election, but they can change the outcome of the election by taking votes away from the main two parties, the Republicans and the Democrats. And when that happens, like I said, people try and blame the third parties for losing. I don't necessarily agree with that, because that means that everyone that voted for that third party would have voted for your candidate, and not for the other, or they wouldn't have just stayed home, which I feel like a lot of people, without being given that third option, would just stay home. And for the others, that vote would probably be split amongst the two. Now, the way that these political parties choose their candidates is normally through primaries, at least for the Republicans and Democrats. That's when you see people from the same party debating, and then people vote on who they want the political candidates to be for that election. This doesn't happen with every election. In the last election, Kamala Harris wasn't picked through primaries. There just wasn't time for that. And in third parties, generally, it's done through other means as well. Now, once election times come, these parties are represented by colors, right? Red, Republicans; blue is Democrats; and then purple is kind of for a state that could go either direction, right? That's a state that could go Republican, could go Democrat. Those are generally referred to as swing states, and we'll talk about those when we talk about voting and elections. So, let's talk about polarization. Now, polarization, like I said earlier, is when people start pulling strongly to one side or to the other, okay? And it often manifests in that widening ideological gap between the Democrats and the Republicans. Members of each party tend to have more extreme and distant positions compared to their counterparts in other parties, okay? And this is something that we can actually look at in graphs that will show how much the Republicans and Democrats have separated from each other, especially in the way that they vote in Congress, right? If you look from all the way back in like the 1940s all the way up through the 1980s, they tend to vote more in the middle. And if you look now, no one really votes in the middle anymore. And if they do, it's never enough to make any kind of huge difference. Okay. Now, when you look at Texas specifically, we know that the Republican Party is pretty much dominant in Texas since the 1990s. They've controlled the governor's seat and the legislative branch pretty much completely. But if we go back to the 1980s and before, Texas was a Democrat state, okay? And it still is in some of the bigger cities like Austin, Houston, Dallas, San Antonio. Those cities still tend to vote more Democrat than Republican, but overall the state is pretty much controlled by Republicans and that more right leaning ideology. So for this week, you guys are going to be looking at the quiz and a journal entry over political parties. Primarily, it's going to be over what you think about third parties in the state of Texas, whether you think they're eventually going to become viable or even if they could become viable in the state. Get through that, get your stuff done, and I will talk to you guys next week.